Give Me Liberty, An American History by Eric Foner, 5th edition, page 65 on Chapter 2, The New England Way, The Rise of Puritanism. As Virginia and Maryland evolved towards societies dominated by a small aristocracy, ruling over numerous bound laborers, a very different social order emerged in the 17th century New England. The early history of what region is intimately connected to the religious movement known as Puritanism, which arose in England late in the 16th century. The term was initially coined by opponents to ridicule those not satisfied with the progress of the Protestant Reformation in England, who called themselves not Puritans, but godly or true Protestants. Puritanism came to define a set of religious principles and a view of how society should be organized. Puritans differed among themselves on many issues, but all shared the conviction that the Church of England retained too many elements of Catholicism in its religious rituals and doctrines. Puritanism saw elaborate church ceremonies, the rule that priests could not marry, and ornate church decorations as vestiges of popery. Many rejected the Catholic structure of religious authority descending from a pope or king to archbishops, bishops, and priests. Only independent local congregations, they believed, should choose clergymen and determine models of worship. These Puritans were called Congregationalists. All Puritans shared many of the beliefs of the Church of England and the society as a whole, including a hatred of Catholicism and a pride in England's greatness as a champion of liberty. But they believed that neither the church nor the nation was living up to its ideals. Puritans considered religious belief a complex and demanding matter and urged believers to seek the truth by reading the Bible and listening to sermons by educated ministries, rather than devoting themselves to sacraments administered by priests and to what Puritans considered formulaic prayers. The sermon was the central rite of Puritan practice. In the course of a lifetime, according to one estimate, the average Puritan listened to some 7,000 sermons. In their religious beliefs, Puritans followed the idea of the French-born Swiss theologian John Calvin. The world, Calvin taught, was divided between the elect and the damned. All persons sought salvation, but whether one was among the elect destined to be saved had already been determined by God. His will, ultimately, was unknowable, and nothing one did on earth, including prayers, good works, and offerings, would make any difference. But while there was no guarantees of salvation, worldly success, leading a good life, prospering economically, might well be indications of God's grace. Idleness and immoral behavior were sure signs of damnation. Moral liberty. Puritanism, however, is not simply a set of ideas, but a state of mind, zealousness in pursuing the true faith that alienated many who held differing religious views. A minority of Puritans, such as those who settled the Plymouth colony, became separatists, abandoning the Church of England entirely to form their own independent churches. Most, however, hoped to purify the church from within. But in the 1620s and 30s, as Charles I seemed to be moving toward a restoration of Catholic ceremonies, and the Church of England dismissed Puritan ministers and censored their writings, many Puritans decided to emigrate. They departed England not so much because of persecution, but because they feared that popish practices had grown to such an intolerable height. As one minister complained, that consciousness of God's saints could no longer bear them. By the same token, Puritans blamed many of England's social problems on the wandering poor, whom they considered indolent and ungodly. When Puritans emigrated to New England, they hoped to escape what they believed to be the religious and worldly corruptions of English society. They would establish a city set upon a hill, a Bible commonwealth whose influence would flow back across the Atlantic and rescue England from godlessness and social decay. Like so many other immigrants to America, Puritans came in search of liberty, especially the right to worship and govern themselves in what they deemed a truly Christian manner. Freedom for Puritans was simply a spiritual affair. It implied the opportunity and the responsibility to obey God's will through self-government and self-denial. It certainly did not mean unrestrained action, improper religious practices, or sinful behavior, of which Puritans thought there were far too many examples in England. In a 1645 speech, to the Massachusetts legislature explaining the Puritan conception of freedom, John Winthrop, the colony's governor, distinguished sharply between two kinds of liberty. Natural liberty, or acting without restraint, suggested a liberty to do evil. This was the false idea of freedom, supposedly adopted by the Irish, Indians, and bad Christians generally. Genuine moral liberty, the Christian liberty described in chapter 1, meant a liberty to that only which is good. It was quite compatible with severe restraints on speech, religion, and personal behavior. True freedom, Winthrop insisted, depended on subjection to authority, both religious and secular, otherwise anarchy was sure to follow. To Puritans, liberty meant that the elect had a right to establish churches and govern society, not that others could challenge their beliefs or authority. The Pilgrims at Plymouth. The first Puritans to immigrate to America were a group of separatists known as the Pilgrims. They had already fled to the Netherlands in 1608, believing that Satan had begun to sow errors, heresies, and discords in England. A decade later, fearing that their children were being corrupted by being drawn into the surrounding culture, they decided to immigrate to Virginia. The expedition was financed by a group of English investors who hoped to establish a base for profitable trade. In September 1620, the Mayflower, carrying 150 settlers and crew, among them many non-Puritans, embarked from England. Blown off course, they landed not in Virginia, but hundreds of miles to the north on Cape Cod. Here the 102 survived the journey, established the colony of Plymouth. Before landing, the Pilgrim leaders drew up the Mayflower Compact, in which the adult men going ashore agreed to obey just and equal laws, enacted by representatives of their own choosing. This was the first written frame of government in what is now the United States. A century earlier, when Giovanni de Verrazzano explored the Atlantic coast of North America, he encountered thickly settled villages and saw the smoke of innumerable Indian bonfires. By the time the Pilgrims landed, hundreds of European fishing vessels had operated off New England, landing to trade with Indians and bringing as elsewhere epidemics. The Pilgrims arrived in an area whose native population had recently been decimated by smallpox. They established Plymouth on the site of an abandoned Indian village whose fields had been cleared before the epidemic and were ready for cultivation. Nonetheless, settlers arrived 6 weeks before winter without food or farm animals. Half died during the first winter. The colonists only survived through the help of local Indians, notably Squanto, who with 20 other Indians had been kidnapped and brought to Spain in 1614 by the English explorer Thomas Hunt, who planned to sell them as slaves. Rescued by a local priest, Squanto somehow made his way to London, where he learned English. He returned to Massachusetts in 1619, only to find that his people had succumbed to disease. He served as an interpreter for the Pilgrims, taught them where to fish and how to plant corn, and helped them in the foregoing of an alliance with Massasoit, a local chief. In the autumn of 1621, the Pilgrims invited their Indian allies to a harvest feast celebrating their survival, the first Thanksgiving in North America. Feasts of Thanksgiving were a feature of Puritan religious practice, not something conducted in this one instance. The Pilgrims hoped to establish a society based on the lives of early Christian saints. Their government rested on a principle of consent, and voting was not restricted to church members. All land was held in common until 1627, when it was divided among the settlers. Plymouth arrived as an independent colony until 1691, but it was soon overshadowed by Massachusetts Bay to its north. The Great Migration. Chartered in 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company was founded by a group of London merchants who hoped to further the Puritan cause to turn a profit through trade with the Indians. The first 5 ships sailed from England in 1629, and by 1642 some 21,000 Puritans had immigrated to Massachusetts. Long remembered as the Great Migration, this flow of population represented less than 1/3 of English emigration in the 1630s. Far more English settlers arrived in Ireland, the Chesapeake, and the Caribbean. After 1640, migration to New England virtually ceased, and in some years, more colonists left the region than arrived. Nonetheless, the Great Migration established the basis for a stable and thriving society. In many ways, the settling of New England was unique. Although servants represented about 1/4 of the Great Migration, most settlers arrived in Massachusetts in families. They came for many reasons, including the desire to escape religious persecution, anxiety about the future for England, and the prospect of economic betterment. Compared with colonists in Virginia and Maryland, they were older and more prosperous, and the number of men and women more equally balanced. Because of the even sex ratio and New England's healthier climate, the population grew rapidly, doubling every 27 years. Although the region received only a small fraction of the century's migration, by 1700 New England's white population of 91,000 outnumbered that of both the Chesapeake and the West Indies. Nearly all were descendants of those who crossed the Atlantic during the Great Migration. The Puritan family, while the imbalance between male and female migrants made it difficult for patriarchal family patterns fully to take root in the Chesapeake until the end of the 17th century, they emerged very quickly in New England. Whatever their differences with the other Englishmen on religious matters, Puritans shared with the larger society a belief in male authority within the household, as well as an adherence to common law traditions that severely limited women's legal and economic right. Puritans in America carefully emulated the family structure of England, insisting that the obedience of women, children, and servants to men's will was the foundation of social stability. The father's authority was all the more vital because in a farming society, without large numbers of slaves or servants, control over the labor of one's family was essential to a man's economic success. To be sure, Puritans deemed women to be the spiritual equals of men, and women were allowed to become full church members. Although all ministers were men, the Puritan belief in the ability of believers to interpret the Bible opened the door for some women to claim positions of religious leadership. The ideal Puritan marriage was based on a reciprocal affection and companionship, and divorce was legal. Yet within the household, the husband's authority was virtually absolute. Indeed, a man's position as head of the family was thought to replicate God's authority in spiritual matters and the authority of the government in the secular realm. Magistrates sometimes intervened to protect wives from physical abuse, but they also enforced the power of fathers over their children and husbands over their wives. Moderate physical correction was considered appropriate for women who violated their husband's sense of proper behavior. Their responsibilities as wives and mothers defined women's lives. In the 1645 speech on liberty, John Winthrop noted that a woman achieved genuine freedom by fulfilling her prescribed social role and embracing subjection to her husband's authority. The family was the foundation of strong communities, and unmarried adults seemed to be a danger to the social fabric. An early law of Plymouth declared that no single person be suffered to live of himself. The typical New England woman married at age 22, a younger age than her English counterpart, and gave birth 7 times. Because New England was a far healthier environment than the Chesapeake, more children survived infancy. Thus, much of a woman's adult life was devoted to bearing and rearing children. Government and society in Massachusetts. In a sermon aboard the Arabella, on which he sailed for Massachusetts in 1630, John Winthrop spoke of the settlers binding themselves together in the bond of brotherly affection in order to promote the glory of God and their own common good. Puritans feared excessive individualism and lack of social unity. Unlike the dispersed plantation-centered society of the Chesapeake, the leaders of Massachusetts organized the colony in self-governing towns. Groups of settlers received a land grant from the colony's government and then subdivided it, with residents awarded house lots in central area and land on the outskirts for farming. Much land remained in commons, either for collective use or to be divided among later settlers or the sons of the town's founders. Each town had its own congregational church. Each, according to the law of 1647, was required to establish a school, since the ability to read the Bible was central to Puritan belief. To train an educated ministry, Harvard College was established in 1636, nearly a century after the Royal University of Mexico, founded in 1551. And 2 years later, the first printing press in English America was established in Cambridge. The government of Massachusetts reflected the Puritans' religion and social vision. Wishing to rule the colony without outside interference and to prevent non-Puritans from influencing decision-making, the shareholders of the Massachusetts Bay Company emigrated to America, taking the charter with them and transforming a commercial document into a form of government. At first, the 8 shareholders chose the men who ruled the colony. In 1634, a group of deputies elected by freemen, land-owning church members, was added to form a single ruling body, the General Court. 10 years later, company officers and elected deputies were divided into 2 legislative houses. Unlike Virginia, whose governors were appointed by first a faraway company and after 1624 by the Crown, or Maryland, where authority rested with a single proprietor, the freemen of Massachusetts elected their governor. The principle of consent was central to Puritanism. Church government was decentralized. Each congregation, as one might put it, had complete liberty to stand alone. Churches were formed by voluntary agreement among members who elected the minister. No important church decision was made without the agreement of male members. Towns governed themselves, and local officials, delegates to the General Court, and the colonial governor were all elected. Puritans, however, were hardly believers in equality. Church membership, a status that carried great prestige and power, was a restrictive category. Anyone could worship at a church, or, as the Puritans preferred to call it, meeting house. But to be a full member required demonstrating that one had experienced divine grace and could be considered a visible saint, usually by testifying about a conversion experience. Although male property holders generally chose local officials, voting in colony-wide elections was limited to men who had been accepted as full church members. As time went on, this meant that a smaller and smaller percentage of the population controlled the government. Puritan democracy was for those within the circle of church membership. Those outside the boundary occupied a secondary place in the Bible Commonwealth. Church and state in Puritan Massachusetts. 17th century New England was a hierarchical society in which socially prominent families were assigned the best land and the most desirable seats in church. Some must be rich, and some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection, declared John Winthrop. This was part of God's plan, reinforced by man-made law and customs. The General Court forbade men and women from wearing the garb of gentlemen. Ordinary settlers were addressed as good man and good wife, while the better sort were called lady or master and mistress. When the General Court of 1641 issued a body of liberties outlining the rights and responsibilities of Massachusetts colonists, it adopted the traditional understanding of liberties as privileges that derived from one's place in the social order. Inequality was considered an expression of God's will, and while some liberties applied to all inhabitants, there were separate lists of rights for freemen, women, children, and servants. The body of liberties also allowed for slavery. The first American slave appears in the record of Massachusetts Bay in 1640. Massachusetts forbade ministers from holding office so as not to interfere with his spiritual responsibilities, but church and state were closely interconnected. The law required each town to establish a church and to levy a tax to support the minister. There were no separate church courts, but the state enforced religious devotion. The body of liberties affirmed the rights of free speech and assembly and equal protection of the law for all within the colony. But the laws of Massachusetts prescribed the death penalty for, among other things, worshiping any god but the Lord God, practicing witchcraft, or committing blasphemy. Like many others in the 17th century, Puritans believed that religious uniformity was essential to social order. They did not believe in religious toleration. There was one truth, and their faith embodied it. Religious liberty meant the liberty to practice this truth. The purpose of the Puritan experiment was to complete the Reformation and, they hoped, spread it back to England. Religious dissent might fatally undermine these goals, but the principle of autonomy for local congregations soon clashed with the desire for religious uniformity. New Englanders divided. The Puritans exalted individual judgment, hence their insistence on reading the Bible. The very first item printed in English America was broadside, The Oath of a Free Man, in 1638, explaining the rights and duties of the citizens of Massachusetts and emphasizing that men should vote according to their own conscience without respect of persons or favor of any men. Yet modern ideas of individualism, privacy, and personal freedom would have struck Puritans as quite strange. They considered too much emphasis on the self dangerous to social harmony and community stability. In the closely knit towns of New England, residents carefully monitored one another's behavior and chastised or expelled those who violated communal norms. In the Puritan view, as one colonist put it, the main freedom possessed by dissenters was the liberty to keep away from us. Towns banished individuals for such offenses as criticizing the church or government, complaining against the colony in letters home to England, or, in the case of one individual, Abigail Gifford, for being a very burdensome woman. Tolerance of difference was not high on the list of Puritan values. Roger Williams. Differences of opinion about how to organize a Bible commonwealth, however, emerged almost from the founding of Massachusetts. With its emphasis on individual interpretation of the Bible, Puritans contained the seeds of its own fragmentation. The first sustained criticism of the existing order came from the young minister Roger Williams, who arrived in Massachusetts in 1613 and soon began to insist that its congregations withdraw from the Church of England and that church and state be separated. Soul liberty, Williams believed, required that individuals be allowed to follow their conscience wherever they led. To most Puritans, the social fabric was held together by certain religious truths, which could not be questioned. To Williams, law-abiding citizens should be allowed to practice whatever form of religion he chose. For the government to molest any person, Jew or Gentile, for either professing doctrine or practicing worship violated the principle that genuine religious faith is voluntary. Williams aimed to strengthen religion, not weaken it. The embrace of government, he insisted, corrupted the purity of Christian faith and drew believers into endless religious wars like those that racked Europe. To leaders like John Winthrop, the outspoken minister's attack on the religious political establishment of Massachusetts was bad enough, but Williams confounded the offense by rejecting the conviction that Puritans were an elect people on a divine mission to spread the true faith. Williams denied that God had singled out any group as special favorites. Rhode Island and Connecticut. Banished from Massachusetts in 1636, Williams and his followers moved south, where they established the colony of Rhode Island, which eventually received a charter from London. In a world in which the right of individuals to participate in religious activities without governmental interference barely existed, Rhode Island became a beacon of religious freedom. It had no established church, no religious qualifications for voting until the 18th century, and no requirements that citizens attend church. It became a haven for dissenters, Protestants who belonged to denominations other than the established churches, and Jews persecuted in other colonies. Rhode Island's frame of government was also more democratic. The assembly was elected twice a year, the governor annually, and the town meetings were held more frequently than anywhere else in New England. Religious disagreements in Massachusetts generated other colonies as well. In 1636, the minister Thomas Hooker established a settlement at Hartford. Its system of government, embodied in the Fundamental Orders of 1639, was modeled on that of Massachusetts, with the significant exception that men did not have to be church members to vote. Quite different was the colony of New Haven, founded in 1630 by immigrants who wanted an even closer connection between church and state. In 1662, Hartford and New Haven received a royal charter that united them as the colony of Connecticut. The trial of Anne Hutchinson. More threatening to the Puritan establishment, both because of her gender and because she attracted a large and influential following, was Anne Hutchinson, a midwife and a daughter of the clergyman. Hutchinson, wrote John Winthrop, was a woman of ready wit and bold spirit. She arrived in Massachusetts with her husband in 1634 to join their minister John Cotton, who had begun expelled from his pulpit in England by church authorities. Hutchinson began holding meetings in her home, where she led discussions of religious issues among men and women, including a number of prominent merchants and public officials. In Hutchinson's views, salvation was God's direct gift to the elect and could not be earned by good works, devotion, practices, or other human effort. Most Puritans shared this. What set Hutchinson apart was her charge that nearly all the ministers in Massachusetts were guilty of faulty preaching for distinguishing saints from the damned on the basis of activities such as church attendance and moral behavior rather than an inner state of grace. In Massachusetts, where most Puritans found the idea of religious pluralism deeply troubling, and church and state reinforced each other, both ministers and magistrates were intent on suppressing any views that challenged their own leadership. Their critics denounced Cotton and Hutchinson for a term for putting one's own judgment or faith above both human law and the teachings of the church. In 1637, she was placed on trial before a civil court for sedition, expressing opinions dangerous to authority. Her position as a public woman made her defiance seem even more outrageous. Her meetings, said Governor Winthrop, were neither comely in the sight of God nor fitting to your sect. A combative and articulate woman, Hutchinson ably debated interpretation of the Bible with her university-educated accusers. She more than held her own during her trial, but when she spoke of divine revelations of God speaking to her directly, rather than through ministers or the Bible, she violated Puritan doctrine and sealed her own fate. Such a claim, the colony's leaders felt, posed a threat to the very existence of organized churches and, indeed, to all authority. Hutchinson and a number of her followers were banished. Her family made its way to Rhode Island and then to Winchester, north of what is now New York City, where Hutchinson and most of her relatives perished during an Indian war. Anne Hutchinson lived in New England for only 8 years, but she left her mark on the religious culture. As in the case of Roger Williams, her career showed how the Puritan belief in each individual's ability to interpret the Bible could easily lead to criticism of the religious and political establishment. It would take many years before religious toleration, which violated the Puritans' understanding of moral liberty and social harmony, came to Massachusetts. Puritans and the Indians, along with disruptive religious controversies, New England, like other colonies, had to deal with the difficult problem of relations with Indians. The native population of New England numbered perhaps 100,000 when the Puritans arrived, but because of recent epidemics, the migrants encountered fewer Indians near the coast than in other parts of eastern North America. In areas of European settlement, colonists quickly outnumbered the native population. Some settlers, notably Roger Williams, sought to treat the Indians with justice. Williams learned complex Indian languages, and he insisted that the king had no right to grant land already belonging to someone else. No town, said Williams, should be established before its site had been purchased. While John Winthrop believed uncultivated land could legitimately be taken by the colonists, he also recognized the benefits of buying land rather than simply seizing it. But he insisted that such purchases, usually completed after towns had already been settled, must carry with them Indian agreement to submit to English authority and pay tribute to the colonists. To New England's leaders, the Indians represented both savagery and temptation. In Puritan eyes, they resembled Catholics with their false gods and deceptive rituals. They enjoyed freedom, but the wrong kind. With Winthrop condemned as undisciplined natural liberty rather than the moral liberty of the civilized Christian, always concerned that sinful persons might prefer a life of ease to hard work, Puritans feared that Indian society might prove attractive to colonists who lacked the proper moral fiber. In 1642, the Connecticut General Court set a penalty of 3 years at hard labor for any colonist who abandoned godly society to live with the Indians. To counteract the attraction of Indian life, the leaders of New England also encouraged the publication of captivity narratives by those captured by Indians. The most popular was The Sovereignty and the Goodness of God by Mary Rowlandson, who had emigrated with her parents as a child in 1639 and was seized along with a group of other settlers and held for 3 months until ransom during an Indian war in the 1670s. Rowlandson acknowledged that she had been well treated and suffered not the least abuse or unchastity, but her book's overriding theme was her determination to return to Christian society. Puritans announced that they would intend to bring Christian faith to the Indians, but they did nothing in the first 2 decades of settlement to accomplish this. They generally saw Indians as an obstacle to be pushed aside.